Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Montreal, Canada for Reason to Resist on November 12th, 2025. In 2007, in a now famous or infamous interview on Democracy Now!, depending on your perspective, U.S. General Wesley Clark, the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, revealed plans within the U.S. military for waging war on 7 countries in the Arab and Muslim world. Over the years, General Clark's revelations from 2007 have been discussed most often in the context of U.S. aggression toward Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Libya. But what has been less discussed is that one of the 7 countries that the Pentagon had targeted, according to Wesley Clark, was Sudan. And in recent weeks, horrifying reports have emerged from this devastated country in the northeast of Africa. Home to an estimated population of some 50 million people, Sudan is suffering through its 3rd civil war since it gained independence in 1956. The 3rd civil war began in April 2023 and is ongoing. On top of all this, Sudan has endured 20 coup attempts and prolonged military rule since gaining independence almost 70 years ago. The current civil war has drawn increasing attention from the international community due to numerous reports that fighters of the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, have committed heinous atrocities in and around the city of El Fasher, which has a population of approximately 1.5 million in the Darfur region of the country. And the RSF is a paramilitary force that is fighting the Sudan Armed Forces for control. Now, there is compelling evidence that the RSF has been supported and armed by the United Arab Emirates. This is the second in a series of reports that Reason to Resist plans to do on the crisis in Sudan. We are turning our attention to this critically important story, in part because of requests from our audience members, but also because the situation there is one that requires greater attention, to put it mildly, from Western governments, and attention of the good kind, not the historically negative interference of Western governments. And so for this, our second report on the crisis in Sudan, we have invited onto our program Mahder Habtemariam. Mahder is a political science doctoral candidate at Syracuse University. She serves as Vice Chairperson of the Global Pan-African Movement, North American Delegation. She's also a member of the International Advisory Board of Pambazuka, a Pan-African news outlet that is intent on providing the facts from a progressive perspective on what is happening on the ground in Africa. Thank you very much for joining us today, Mahder.
Thank you so much for having me, Dimitri.
So before we begin, I'd like to remind our audience to like and share this video if they find it informative. And if you're not already a subscriber of Reason to Resist, we strongly encourage you to become one. We've grown rapidly since we launched this channel last year, but in recent weeks, and in particular since the ceasefire in Gaza went into effect on October 11th, we've seen multiple indications that work of our nature, our own work and those of our peers, is being suppressed on social media. And so you can help us to overcome the censors by becoming a subscriber if you're not already one. Now, Mahder, before I ask you about recent events on the ground, I'd like to talk to you about the reasons for which the Pentagon and the U.S. government might have targeted Sudan back in the early 2000s. What is it about the country that would have drawn this level of hostility from the U.S. political and military elite?
Well, Dimitri, I think in terms of, I know I did watch the other show you had, so I do know the video you're talking about. So I'm not sure in what context really Sudan was discussed, but in the 2000s, Sudan is under sanctions from the US government. You know, Omar al-Bashir, the leader in the Islamist party, is being accused of working with the Muslim Brotherhood. And so the US sees them as a target, as like one of the Muslim Brotherhood countries that are supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. And so that perhaps is likely the reason as to why Sudan was on that list and is part of like a list of countries that were supposed to be targeted as part of this war on terror. But yeah, I think the reality of I did want to like correct something you said, because you said Sudan, this is the third civil war in Sudan. And I do like want to say I would call it a counter-revolutionary war and not a civil war. And so perhaps maybe we can talk about that after your next few questions. But I just wanted to make that correction because I think it's much more explanatory to call it a counter-revolutionary war instead of a civil war.
Well, that's thank you for that correction.
Yeah.
Why don't you elaborate on that now? That's obviously a
Yeah.
important perspective that I think we need to explore.
Yeah, so I mean, a civil war insinuates it's a war and it's an internal war, by two different armed groups in the country. I mean, that is really what's happening. But the nature of how these two groups are strengthened, or how they function, or how the war itself is sustained has nothing to do with these internal forces. So I call it a counter-revolutionary war because what really happened in 2023, April 2023, when the war broke out, is really a part of the revolution that had started in 2019. So 2018, 2019, what is now referred to as the December Revolution, is when you have the masses of Sudan, led by women and youth, come out to the streets and demand a different Sudan. And so really this revolution started off as mass protest, mass uprising, but it really evolved to become a revolutionary movement with an organized group, capable alternative growing by the day. And it really exhausted the repressive capacity of the state. And not only exhausted that repressive capacity, but it also really became a challenge to the nature of how Sudan's politics and economy was organized. By the day, the kind of the revolutionary forces were adamant on organizing Sudan for the sake of Sudanese people. And so really the nature of the war is about how that process needed to be stopped and who was going to stop it. And so I don't think it's fair to call it a civil war, because the nature of whether it's the RSF we're looking at, and we can go into that, or even how SAF is resupplied, the standing army is resupplied, and what weapons it's using, it's really not about these two different forces. It's really about their external supporters.
So this popular movement that you describe and that emerged in 2019, what were, other than democratic reform, sounds like that was one of its core demands. What were its core demands? And is it represented by some particular political formation and or armed group, or was it sort of not particularly organized and purely of a peaceful nature?
So this is actually the work I do. Like, my research itself is on the revolutionary process in Sudan, and I look at it at least in three cycles. So you have that first cycle between first you have 2018 and April 2019. That's the fall of Omar al-Bashir. That first cycle, you're really seeing it's kind of a mass protest. You see, like, there's horizontal coordination of like professional groups, workers on the ground. There's a resuscitation of the different like labor groups that were working underground. You have these things called the resistance committees emerging. They had already come out in 2013 as part of mass protests, but now they come out more organized, and these are essentially like neighborhood scale organized bodies that are going to be coordinating protests, but also doing much more other things, including services. And so that first phase is, you see everybody's on the streets. The slogan is really freedom, peace, and justice, right? We want the Islamists gone. It's a clear generation saying we do not want Islamist rule. We do not want oppression. We do not want public order laws. We do not want the nature of Sudan's economic integration to the world to be at the benefit of foreign interests. We want it to be at the benefit. So once that happens, the military comes in and says, okay, we've removed Omar al-Bashir. We're going to take power for a few years and ensure there's a stable transition. Really, the streets like go out, and there's like a stalemate because people utterly refuse. We do not want military rule, like, because the Islamist regime that came in with Omar al-Bashir came in 1989 as part of a military coup in partnership with the Muslim Brotherhood. So what happens is, once there's kind of people refuse, there's military rule, there's a transitional government that's created. And so this transitional government is going to be made up of a half military, half civilian council, right? A sovereignty council, and it'll have a cabinet of technocrats and like civilians.
And
So
sorry, at that moment, was it a purely secular formation, or were there Islamists within this transition government?
well, you have so it's the military is part of the former regime, and so the initial person who had told we removed Omar al-Bashir, that so some of the generals are known to be Islamists, are so that nature of like, oh, was there like a clear like difference? Not really, like, but was there? Of course, there was some. They weren't really the Islamists because there was also like an internal kind of power struggle ongoing at the same time. And so the transitional government is really like the Sovereignty Council, which is made up of half of the military and the militias, is made up of new elements like the militias, the RSF, but also older elements like SAF, the military, who is tied to the Islamist party through and through. So that transitional government is formed, a constitutional declaration is written at the, support of the international community. All of the international powers are supporting this. Even though there was a clear, like, the people did not want the military in power, but there was kind of a concession needed to be made. And, in the name of stability, that was allowed. So that happened, and you have until October 2021. So this is the second cycle, right? After the fall of the regime, you have a transitional government in place that sustains the military's role in politics and economy, and then creates a transitional government. So what happens with the transitional government is really like you see the international community, which is whether you're referring to the Quad, the four countries that are currently being referenced in relation to Sudan, or you're looking at what are called the Friends of Sudan, which include a larger group, including Norway and France and Canada. And so they come in and they really help facilitate this transitional government. It's about reintegrating Sudan into the global capitalist economy, right? It's about junk bonds are being revived, right? Sudan is gonna, so for the US, really, Sudan is yet another way to ensure its unipolar kind of role in the world. So it's about opening up Sudan's markets. The IMF is once again in play. The IMF comes in, subsidy removals are at play. There's certain things that happen that by the time this transitional government in power, economy is even deteriorating even worse. We're looking at COVID, that's happening. Even during COVID, you have the US who's taking essentially punishing the government and making them pay 335 million for a bombing that was related to the former regime at a time where they're going through COVID. They're cash strapped. A lot is happening in the country. There's a lot of instability at the same time because the shifts between when this is happening, they're also forming like the JPA. There's another agreement being formed by armed groups and the military, right? So that armed groups can be included, like because in Darfur you've had armed groups. In Blue Nile State, there are states where there have been armed groups during the regime itself, right? Like at war with the central state in Khartoum. So those are incorporated, and you kind of see essentially it's a power sharing agreement for the local elites, and kind of for the international community, it's an opening up of Sudan's economy and the way politics and economy is run, and so. That's the second phase. What happens right there is in October 2021, you have a military coup. The military actually does a coup, and this is the RSF and SAF together, right? This is together, they conduct a coup, and they essentially, some of the civilian leaders are arrested. They're later released a few days later, but still, there's no essentially, they kick out the civilians and they kind of work back some of them in slowly, kind of because they're getting an external pressure. But it's a coup regime.
Just pause there to clarify one thing. You're saying that the suppression of this movement among civilians was a joint enterprise of the Sudan Armed Forces and the RSF.
Oh, yes.
They were in cahoots.
Oh, yes.
Trying to reestablish some form of authoritarian
100%.
government, military. Understood.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I'm going to show you where it really gets messed up and how the international community really enables this superficial partnership that was bound to end up where we are today. And
Right.
so what happens is this coup happens, there's even hesitance to call it a coup. It's like, oh, we condemn what's happening, the violence, civilians need to be back. And there's this civilian-led transition. Like there is no, we know, like I'm a political scientist, we know the separation of, the military from politics is so central to any, foundational like democratic government, but there is a complete like complicity in actually allowing the military to sustain its role in politics. And by the way, the military also has a strong role in economy, so that means also sustaining their kind of huge ownership of a lot of things, including a lot of state assets. And so the coup happens. Together, they conduct a coup. And this is the third. At the same time, by the way, while the transitional government is happening, there's almost daily demonstrations. The revolutionary, like, there's more organizing. The resistance committees are organizing even more. They're doing more things, like they're providing services in different regions, in Darfur, in Jazeera. They're doing like COVID related like cleanups. They're doing service provision, like flour availability for some people. So they're really taking on the role of government while they're actually like coordinating protests, demonstrations, political activities. Some are lobbying government, some are working with government, some are challenging, like completely conducting sit-ins and like different kinds of civil disobedience. There's strikes happening because different sectors are also being challenged. And so that is essentially also why the coup kind of happens. It's like the military wants to kick out the civilians and reassert full control of the country. Because the way it's going, the revolutionary forces are gaining ground, even with this bureaucratic, like the technocratic civilians being tied to foreign capital. And so after the coup, there's like I told you, there's like a hesitancy to even call it a coup, but eventually like there's a call to civilian ledge. Some of the former civilians are reintegrated into this coup regime, but the streets come out with a new slogan. It's just no compromise, no negotiation, no, I always forget the three no's, but the three no's, essentially, we do not want anything to do with the military. Like the military needs to go.
So what time frame are we now looking at? Is this around?
So now we're 2021.
Okay, 2021.
The
All
coup
right.
has happened and the streets are even more angered, and now there's a double down. There's really like this is the third cycle where I call it like there's a charter that's written. Essentially, there's many charters that are formed through these resistance committees. I'm telling you, and there's a lot written on the resistance committee. I would urge people to look into what's going on, because some of the even war, right now, the war conditions and who's actually providing services is these committees that turned into different kinds of bodies. So they essentially there's a few charters that emerge, right? Some of these different the Maarno and Sennar state in 3 different states. So then what happens is they try to merge it, because the coup is like really like that shows them that, okay, the military can't be trusted. We need to like figure out a transitional process. And so they end up writing what is called the Revolutionary Charters for People's Power. And that document, you'll see it, it's like very clear, right? It's a Sudan for Sudanese people. It's very clear about the role of external forces in enabling brutal regimes. It's very clear about the role of external forces extracting resources, exploiting Sudanese labor. And so this charter says we want free schools, we want free curriculum, we want like gold to be properly exported, legally, and we want resources to be reinvested into the people. It's a very like, very clear demand, and it has steps. The charter also has, okay, this is how we're going to first create a transitional legislative body. We're going to do that. So the reality is where there was a completely democratic process where these young people were taking these charters, going back to like neighborhoods, calling meetings, telling people, getting input. And it's a really democratically profound document that we have. So while this is happening, at the same time, you have all these like Quad and Friends of Sudan helping what is called UNITAMS as a UN body, and they're essentially trying to create another power sharing agreement between the RSF, the army, and these other forces who are willing to be reincorporated, whether they're civilian. And at this point, the civilian forces at the state level have fractured so much, because after the coup, some decided to support, some didn't. But essentially, you have this framework agreement showing up, right? And this is being uploaded by Friends of Sudan, by the Quad, and saying, oh, this is great. This is essentially another power sharing agreement that's going to keep the RSF and the army in power. But it doesn't really hold out, because first of all, there's no discussion about how the RSF is going to be demilitarized and reintegrated into the army, which tells you there was no leverage for the army to some extent. And so it really becomes a point of, it's either going to be the revolutionaries who take power in Sudan because they're more capable and ready, or it's going to be one of these forces, right? And the RSF is unwilling to be incorporated into the standing army, and the standing army sees the RSF also as an alternative threat to some extent to their power. So it's like I cannot tell you, Dimitri, there was so many analysis that was coming out that everybody was kind of predicting the war, because internally also there were some frictions being shown. But yet there was this framework agreement being lauded as like, an exceptional document that's going to lead the transition. And you have them sign it. I think December 2022 is when they sign it, and they're supposed to sign more 2 phases, and those are delayed because there's internal problems, but eventually the war breaks out.
Okay, just pausing there. So you said the framework agreement was being lauded by whom? Was it by the Quad, which
Yeah,
I understand
it's
it
the
is
Quad. It's called the tripartite mechanism. You have the UN,
correct?
the AU, and IGAD, which is a regional body, and you also have the Friends of Sudan, right? Like all of these, like they're sending envoys, they're saying congratulations for signing this, a great step, civilian-led transition. But it's really not. You actually had a whole other document that was like from the people and democratically like produced document you could have used to support civilians in Sudan for transition
Correct.
if democracy was really what you were trying to support.
So,
But everybody knows.
clarify for people who don't know, didn't watch our first report on Sudan. The Quad
Yeah.
is the United States, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Well, I doubt you'll disagree with me on this, but the latter 3, Egypt, Saudi, and the UAE, are essentially vassals of Washington, proxies of Washington in the region. You mentioned the EU getting, its hands dirty in all of this. So was this really, this initiative, this framework agreement, was this really being promoted by Western states and their proxies in the region? Is that what it comes down to?
I mean, that's my analysis, right? Like what it comes down to is that you had 2 parallel processes happening in the country, right? And both were like real, like the revolutionary forces were very organized by this 3rd cycle, right? Like they had bodies, there was a process, it was transparent, they had mechanisms of getting information around, they were active, they were actually getting concessions in some states. And so you had a capable body that was doing something, and then you go and decide to support this whole other process. And this framework agreement was drafted by the Sudan Bar Association, but nobody really knows how the initial drafting happened. And, so it's this very vague document that you're going to be supporting. So yes, I mean, my analysis is definitely, but there's reason for that, right? Like it's the nature of this war itself, the revolution itself, is how Sudan has been integral to global capitalism, and how that integration, the subordinated integration of Sudan to global capital, has been through force. And so the military, whether we're looking at in which a lot of the institutions were continued because of the nature of how the independence struggle was compromised. And, all of this, even the charter outlines, right? Like since at least colonialism, there has been like an integration of Sudan into global economy in a way that doesn't benefit the people. And that integration has often come with force, right? With organized violence being necessary. And so, I mean, yeah, I'll just stop there and let you.
Okay. Well, so I want to come back to the charter in a moment, but just to complete your chronology of what unfolded. So this framework agreement is being promoted by, in an anti-democratic manner, as I understand it, by essentially Western forces and their proxies in the region. But somehow this appears to have broken down and resulted in just extraordinarily destructive, violent conflict between the RSF and the Sudan armed forces. So, and I hope I didn't skip over, some other phase in there that you want to talk about. If so, please do. But how does it break down, and how do we get to where we are today, where there's this extraordinary violence being inflicted upon, ordinary citizens in Sudan, certainly by the RSF and possibly also by the Sudan armed forces? How does that happen?
So, I mentioned to you before we started that I wrote an article, and I tried to show this, like, I don't systematically, like, in my research, which is like a larger work, so I can't, like, off the top of my head, reference it to you, but throughout, forget, like, pre-revolutionary period, like, pre-2018, where violence was consistent in any extractive industry, like whether you're looking at even what you call the civil war with South Sudan, had a lot to do with oil, and had a lot to do with controlling oil exports, and had a lot of complicity from global economic structures and powers that knew very well what was happening in South Sudan, the massacres, the killings that were happening but they wanted the oil from Khartoum to flow. And so that reality, like, has always created consistent violence in Sudan. What's happening in Al Fashir is a matter of scale. it is like an egregious, like sharpened and heightened scale, but the reality of massacres has been present. Since at least the 1990s, there's been massacres happening in Darfur at the hands of the state and its militia, right? The RSF itself was like, used to be a government militia, right? It's the government that created it. Omar al-Bashir's regime created it at a moment where they wanted more suppression in Darfur, right? And it's the same way when they fought wars in South Sudan, also they raised militias, and they did it the same way the British did it. They raised militias through ethnic, racial, religious lines that are going to create a kind of divide between the communities. And so this war and the kind of the violence that erupted, it was happening throughout all the cycles as I was telling you about. In 2021, during the transitional government, there is massacres happening in Darfur. I think early 2021, like between Jan and April, I think almost 300 people were killed in El Geneina, another city in Darfur, in West Darfur. So, but you saw, and at that time, the resistance committees of that region were putting out statements saying that our sit-ins are being raided, there's complete violence, we're afraid of an imminent massacre and attack. They asked the transitional government, the Sovereignty Council, the army for help. No one came, and that massacre happened, right? And so this is what happened in Al-Fashir too. Like, everybody has been calling that this was going to happen, and it's been happening at different scales. You know, even the reality of Al-Fashir, like a large percent of the population is from Zamzam camp, and Zamzam camp is one of the biggest internally displaced refugee camps in Sudan. And that camp itself was created because of the nature of cyclical violence, where people had to consistently flee, and now they're placed in a place like Zamzam camp, right, where they were easy targets, which they're put in these kind of contained spaces and become targets for any political power and anybody willing to use violence as leverage for politics. And so this is like I told you, 2021, back-to-back massacres are happening. Militias are implicated. The army itself is implicated. There's no like, the international community is completely not talking about this. They're considering these like leaders as capable political leaders, but when we're seeing they're not. And I didn't tell you, but through all these cycles, so the first cycle when Omar al-Bashir fell, there was a sit-in that was erected around the army headquarters in Khartoum. There were sittings happening in multiple cities. It wasn't just Khartoum. But on June, the Khartoum sit-in was the largest sit-in, right? It ended up being over 100 hectares, and it ended up lasting over 50 days. And so this sit-in, and people were visiting it from different regions. And Bashir fell, and the sit-in didn't like end. It continued because it wanted military out. And how the sit-in was actually removed on June 3rd, 2019, which was called the Ramadan Massacre, is that the RSF, SAF, police forces, and these other riot gear police go in and brutally raid it, and they kill hundreds of people. There's dead bodies floating in the Nile. They rape women and men and little kids, and they completely destroy the sit-in. And those are the same forces that were allowed to be in the transitional government. The same leaders that did that massacre were treated like capable political leaders that could negotiate and transition Sudan into a democracy. And I know, like, that's just crazy, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't think
You're
it would
using
take
the
a political
passive.
scientist. Oh?
I'm sorry, you're using the passive, and I just want to be very clear about this. You're saying we're treated. Could you just elaborate? Treated by whom? Are we talking again about Western governments?
Yeah, I mean, there's a legitimation process, right?
Right.
Like,
Right.
I'm telling you, internally, especially the June 3rd massacre was another thing. Right after it happened, there was a Millions March organized, there were strikes organized because the streets were refusing, right? Like, the majority of Sudanese people that were organizing and through this revolutionary moment were rejecting what was happening. So now I'm forced to ask, then who is legitimizing these forces, treating them as capable, allowing them to have these positions? It definitely was not the majority of Sudanese people. And one of the largest chants was Madaniya, civilian rule. Like, so it was definitely not so then I ask, okay, who? Of course, internal dynamics matters, but it's the regional forces, you said, like the vassal states that support each side and also that have an interest in these sides, right? Whether you're looking at the UAE, there's multiple reports about how gold is completely, funneled to the UAE. And so who controls the gold mines? Who has access to these things? Whether you're looking at the EU, the RSF, like a large part of how the RSF becomes a standing militia, like capable to rival the standing operating army is really because it's getting all of these kinds of resource support throughout since its beginning as a militia. So they were a Janjaweed created as a militia force to support government as like essentially the army's kind of supportive force, right? Like a more mobile supportive force that you don't have to pay as much. That's how militias were raised in Darfur. But eventually, how do they become so strong is one time you look at 2014, there's this Khartoum process. The EU wants to do what it was doing in Libya, right? It wants to stop Africans from coming to its borders. So it pays the government of Sudan to essentially make the RSF these border guards. So they're upgraded from a militia to a border guard. That means logistical support. That means some trainings, workshops being offered to these militia forces, right? And I mean, that also means Western corporations are getting paid because all of this is how it works. But essentially, what you're looking at is from even how how the RSF itself becomes a strong power to how it becomes a political force in the country to how it's considered a capable political body. A lot of that legitimization process, a lot of that reinforcement is coming from the outside. Internally, everybody has rejected, and like Sudanese people have seen military rule. That was just one of the clearest demands of the revolution.
So do you think, Mahi, that it would be fair to say that the primary targets of the RSF and the Sudan Armed Forces are not each other, but the people who are demanding civilian rule and democratic reform in the country? Are they more interested in training their guns upon those people than on each other? Is that a fair characterization of the situation?
Yeah, well, it's both, it's both because it's a matter of like, it's either or. It's one of them is going to take over, not both of them, right? Whoever is going to capture state power and be considered the legitimate force is going to be either or. They've reached a point where they're not going to come together. So in that sense, they're still very much fighting each other, right? But the reality is, even when when the army liberated cities or whatever, it killed revolutionaries. They targeted resistance committee members. So yes, this is very much about, there is the objective enemy of both forces is the people, right? And the revolutionary moment that has just demanded, we will never go back. After the coup happened, the slogan became, we will never go back to, and there were daily demonstrations and political activities that just exhausted the state.
Right. So let's just talk about this charter. I believe you described it as a charter that these resistance committees developed.
Yeah.
Do you think you could fairly describe the program that these committees were putting forward as one that was socialist in nature?
Yeah. I mean, there wasn't any like clear calls for socialism or anything like that, right? But it was socialist in nature as a socializing processes of like, everything. So it's free schools, better curriculums, more economic policy that addresses the different like regional differentiation in different regions, the inequalities of histories, justice like for the militia, for the military, for the militias to be held accountable, for justice for the martyrs and the victims. And so I would say it was humanist. It was more than socialist. It was humanist. It was just, we want to live and let live. And it was people asking for, basic things like, and that was even the nature of who were the revolutionary forces, right? It was everyday people who wanted better lives for themselves, for their children. And, yeah.
So
the charter is available online, so I can share that with you too.
Yeah, we'll definitely put a link to it in the description to the video. I've not heard. I'm embarrassed to say I've not heard of the charter before, and I'll definitely familiarize myself with the charter. So to go back to my original question about these cycles in this process, is this movement, this grassroots movement, presented by a particular political party at this stage, or a particular armed group, or other armed? Like it could be several. It could not necessarily one party, not necessarily one armed group, or has it not achieved that sort of level of, shall we say, political maturity yet?
No. So different cycles, you see different, like, because dynamics are shifting like consistently. So for instance, like I told you, there was a moment where most of the armed groups supported the resistance committees and the people on the ground, the ones organizing the civil disobedience, and so some of the armed groups supported them. They said that we support the kind of change they're asking for, and wholly put our support behind them. But then they created the JPA, like another like power sharing agreement between armed groups and the military. That kind of lost out that support, right? So this is by the third cycle. But by the third cycle, there is a clear revolutionary force, right? Like it's the resistance committees are at the core of it because they're the ones who are the most organized nationally. They're the ones also they're organized in a way there's like local autonomy, but there's like national coordination, right? Because the nature of how each resistance committee is going about things is really like locally decided and it represents and reflects the local. But the nature, like the how they're like evolving and deciding things is consistently becoming more coordinated and more institutionalized in a way. Like I think the charter was part of that. The charter stated how they were going to create transitional legislative bodies and through what kinds of electoral processes that was going to happen throughout the next coming months. And so yes, they were there. You had factions of the SPA because some of the SPA also split, which is the Sudanese Professionals Association. So you have those groups also supporting and signing on to the charter. You have groups like TAMS, these labor bodies that are emerging, they're also supporting this. You have mining entities, like these mining bodies that have emerged. And so they're all signing on to this, right? Like these grassroots kinds of bodies. But really the most name worthy would be the resistance committees at this cycle. And yeah, they were definitely organized and capable.
And are they currently armed? Are they fighting back?
No, I mean, well, no. Like I told you, it's a national, and my study is not national, so I don't even have that grasp of like I haven't done national case studies. I just have interviewees from different regions. But what happened is different things. Some of the resistance committees became what are known the emergency response rooms. They essentially started just responding to the war. Some resistance committees still exist, like Al-Fashir, the Al-Fashir resistance committees put out a statement days before the city fell. They put out a statement because the Khartoum resistance committees put out a statement in solidarity with them, and they had responded to that, and they were saying the revolution will continue even though we're facing these things. This is days before it fell. So some resistance committees are still active, right, but probably not functioning at the capacity they function because just the war has made even anything else barely functional. Some young people have joined the army. Some young people have joined the RSF. For some people, it's a matter of survival. So different dynamics, different areas you're looking at because the war is really brutal.
And my understanding is that Sudan is rather ethnically diverse. Were these resistance committees pluralistic from an ethnic perspective, or was there one or two ethnic groups that were particularly the driving force behind the resistance committees?
Yeah, no ethnic affiliations. There was always like ethnic differences brought in fractures internally in resistance committees, like to be expected. Like I told you, when some of the elite armed groups are signing deals and stuff, that kind of trickled down to create some differences on the ground as well, because like you had people from these different ones that were armed group or something to become a resistance committee member that now did not want to be because their armed group has signed on to an agreement with the army or something. And so there's like generally dynamics shifts like that, but nothing and that's why maybe a humanist like the biggest drive of the revolution was this anti-racist, anti-Islamist, like anti-capitalist kind of drive, right? Like the young people were saying like, we don't want to inherit a history of division. And I think that was why it was such a threat. You have a majority Muslim country, right? Especially after South Sudan seceded. First, Sudan is referred to as the microcosm of Africa. So the kind of binary identity, like, Muslim, Arab, Muslim, Christian, Arab, like it really, things don't work like that at the, functional basis. They serve political roles, like manipulation of these things serve political roles, but they're by no means like actually express how people live and how people identify, because that is much more dynamic than anything binary Western constructivism can conceptualize. But so the power of this revolution was really addressing and admitting past grievances related to race, related to ethnicity, related to, because it's since colonialism, the British preferred to put the Arab, like a certain Arab northern group in power. And that has been cyclically, recursively just reiterating through the years, even though certain things have changed. And so this generation said no to that, right? Like, we want a free and open Sudan, a Sudan with like where any ethnicity, any person can live. And that was part of the threat. It was a threat to the military leaders to the militia leaders whose legitimacy rests on these manipulations of Arabness and whatnot. It's a threat to regional forces who use division of Christian and Muslim to keep societies separated. So for one of the most diverse countries in Africa to come together as a people and say, we want to create a new way forward together, I think that has been probably one of the biggest challenges for global capitalism in a while, to be honest.
So can you talk to us a bit about what Sudan gained independence from in 1955? My understanding, again, I'm just beginning to educate myself and be educated about the history of this country, this fascinating country.
Yeah.
But my understanding is when it gained independence from some kind of joint British-Egyptian colonial power. Is that fair? Could you talk to us about the pre-independence state of affairs?
Yeah, so the Anglo-Egyptian condominium, that is essentially, so before that, the colonialism comes to Egypt in the form of Ottoman colonialism, but then after that you have the Mahdist revolution. It's really like, and Sudan also, just to add into this fascinating history you're talking about, has one of the strongest histories of labor struggles, whether it's like 1940s, some of the earliest labor union movements on Africa and some of the like best organized, and anti-colonial, right? There are anti-colonial labor movements at the same time. But you also have the Mahdist revolution is one revolution that is anti-colonial. It kind of unites some areas, some regions, filled with internal contradictions in and of itself, but was really a threat to British colonialism because the Ottomans and British were working together. And the defeat came at General Gordon. It was a British general, and that was a huge defeat for the British Empire. And so you see after the Mahdist Revolution, the British now, they raise armies in Egypt because they are also in Egypt at this point, and there's a reconquest of Sudan. And
sorry, when does that happen, Maki?
So this has to be 19. This is 1889.
Okay. Please continue.
Yeah. But
so after this,
I'm doing a quick fact check. Yeah, so 1889 is 1899 is the reconquest.
Okay. And so
between 1881 and 1889, you have the Mahdist Revolution. So then there's the reconquest. This is with Egypt and the British. It's really a massacre because the British have weapons now, and so the conquest was much easier than the revolution. And so after that, the Anglo-Egyptian condominium is it lasts until 1956, and in 1956, independence comes, of course, through anti-colonial struggles, but the way in which, like I told you, there's a compromise. First, I think it's worth mentioning because the British colonialism is really central to how Sudan has been integrated into global capitalism. And so that is at a time where you see the Gazira scheme is one of the largest agriculture schemes in the world. And that was set up to produce cotton for the British. And this is also where you see the kind of forced exploitation of Sudanese people because you had you had sedentary farmers, but you had pastoralists, you had a mobile kind of labor force that colonialism slowly shifted into kind of sedentary. That changes a lot. And the British really also do a lot in terms of crafting this kind of division between Southern Sudan and Northern Sudan. And it's by design, it's by intention. They do a lot into manufacturing ethnicities. Mahmoud Mamdani has a great chapter on that in his book, Neither Settler Nor Native. But essentially what happens is this kind of the Gazir scheme shows you how Sudan will continue to be reintegrated. So by the time the British, there's like independence struggles being waged, mutinies in Sudan, like I told you, labor movements, Sudanese Women's Union, one of the largest women's union, is also active at that time. And there's mass uprising, but that leads to independence. But during independence, the British really kind of a few years right before train these kinds of particular class of what are considered Northern Arab, particular ethnic group, Muslim folks, and they put them in power. Like not they put them in power, but they're already running some of the agricultural schemes, and they're essentially they also have since they're related to their political parties, they're related to different constituencies. So they essentially take over, and so. I think 2 years later, there's a military coup, and that's the first military regime under Aboud is created, right? And so Aboud is also friends with the British, but military guy. It's the brutal policy of Arabization, Islamization is against the South, and so that happens, and you have a popular uprising, 1964. So 2018 is actually the third time the Sudanese remove a military government from power through mass popular uprisings. And so 1964, the first military regime is removed from power through a mass uprising. But there's kind of a reconsolidation of the same political forces after a few years. And then you have Nimari, that's a socialist government come in, another military coup with a socialist leaning. But that socialist leaning quickly dissipates as internal contradictions and Nimari himself kind of changes his alliances from the socialists in Sudan, from the Communist Party of Sudan to the Islamists. And so 1970s is really a shift because there's that shift. The state is shifting from like a brief like socialist period to an Islamization of sorts and a Muslim integration of the Muslim Brotherhood. But 1970s is also, really when you feel American-led capitalism emerge in Sudan, right? You have Chevron discovers oil in Sudan for the first time through the help of US aid. And so that opens up that whole oil sector. And so the oil sector then fuels the war in South Sudan. And the article I mentioned to you that I write, it talks about, because there's this great, everybody should go check them out, Attar Network. It's a great English Arabic journal created by the Sudanese diaspora. But one article on there did a great job of talking about the French bank PNB Paribas, about how the bank was fully aware how the money was being funneled through the government for the Sudanese government, and it was creating mass atrocities. But they're moving billions of dollars for the government. So really, the petrodollars kept moving, so the massacres in South Sudan happened, and so that led to kind of the independence of South Sudan. In 1985, Nimari is removed once again through popular uprising, right? But a few years of a transitional period, a democratic government, in 1989, Bashir and the Islamists come in with their own military coup.
So you talked to us. Please talk to us about the resource wealth of the country and how that's factoring in here. You mentioned gold. You mentioned oil. Yeah. I also understand that I saw a reference to Sudan becoming the breadbasket of the Middle East, particularly the United Arab Emirates and other Gulf countries. What are the primary resources that are coveted by foreign actors? And are there particular corporations, multinational corporations, that are involved in extracting these resources and exploiting the Sudanese people?
So the nature of Sudan has vast agricultural wealth. It has vast land, vast livestock. It's one of the top producers of livestock in Africa. And so generally, the nature of how the economy has been organized has shifted, but the processes kind of remain the same. Like I told you, the Gazira scheme itself is one of the largest agriculture schemes in the world. It was intended to produce cotton for the global market, for the British Empire. And so after that, really, once the oil comes into play, oil becomes the commodity that the whole economy is kind of structured around. And so for oil, everybody was involved in Sudan, in Sudan's oil extraction process, from Malaysia to China to to France, to the US itself, to some capacity, to British, Rolls-Royce, like you name it, from like setting up the pipelines to creating the infrastructure, to actually extracting the oil and selling it. A range of international forces were involved in that. But what you see in 2011, after the independence of South Sudan, is almost 70% of the oil fields are in South Sudan. And so there's an automatic complete like collapse of the economy because the economy was so centered around that, right? And so that brings like kind of a search for new commodities. And that's when gold really takes over. Gold was always really a thing, but after 2011, it becomes the commodity around which most revenue is being generated and the GDP is structured in your, like export levels. And so in terms of gold, okay, let me back up. Like 70s, when you said the breadbasket of Africa, that's the 70s. In the 70s, it's happening. There's a huge influx of Gulf and like World Bank, like IMF funding for agriculture in Sudan with this. But what that creates is a lot of land appropriation, right? It's a lot of so a lot of the things we witness in Darfur really come as a result of these kinds of shifts. There's land being taken from people. So you have sedentary and pastoralist communities. Some don't, like, they're mobile. You can't, the moment you enclose a land, you own it, you guard it, that means people can't have access to it in ways that they used to. And that's really that, in addition to climate change, is the root of the kind of things that we've been witnessing, fratricide we've been witnessing in Darfur region. But it has a lot to do with IMF and Gulf funding and land holdings across Sudan. And so, I mean, I think after the 90s, the rate at which land is appropriated is just infinitely more aggressive. And all of this is through foreign capital. But at the same time, like I'm telling you, there's that process of land, but there's also gold extraction happening. Other resources like gum arabic, Sudan was sanctioned by the US, like I told you, for the longest, but resources like gum arabic, which is central to Coca-Cola and M&Ms and things like that, were, of course, they were not affected by the sanctions, right? So you have groundnuts, like you have other general like exports, livestock also being like the Saudis, the UAE really benefit a lot from livestock and agricultural produce from Sudan. And so gold really, though, it further militarizes. Like I told you, oil itself was militarized because there was a southern Sudan. But gold itself, like some of the militias themselves start controlling some of the gold mines. And that tells you how the RSF has direct relations with the United Arab Emirates, right? It has direct relations because the UAE directly approaches it in order to illegally smuggle its gold, right? It doesn't have to go through the state or the government.
So I would be interested in knowing, as I'm sure our audience would, who is profiting from this gold extraction, and particularly, as I indicated, are there large multinational corporations that are involved in all of this? So where is that gold going, and who's profiting from it primarily?
Yeah, a lot of the gold, majority of the illicit gold is going to the UAE. And ironically enough, both the government and the militias export gold and other resources to the UAE, even though the army is accusing the UAE of supporting the RSF. And so a lot of the gold extraction has been like in the Darfur region initially when it had started. And so that explains how, also another reason, how the Jebel Mara region, how the RSF were strengthened further, like into how militia groups were further strengthened. But after 2011, there's like gold being extracted from different regions, right? Not just Darfur. And so there's like a gold rush. I mean, there's a global gold rush, and Sudan sits at the heart of that global gold rush in a sense. There are multiple countries. Like it's illicit gold. I don't do much studies on how the gold is being moved, but I can definitely give you a range of references that discusses how it's moved through the UAE, how it's moved from Sudan itself. But what we do know of, because like I told you, I mainly study the revolution and kind of a social history of people in Sudan, is part of the revolutionary demands were about gold extraction and how it had become, first of all, it had been destroying communities because you have artisanal miners who are like bringing this gold out. And this means these miners are, first of all, they're mobile, they're traveling from different places to get to these now mining places that are offering jobs because the oil economy is now destroyed, right? And like there's not a lot of livelihood opportunities anyway. So once they go there, they get paid like, this, I'm referring to one study on gold at least, is they get paid like $2 to $4 a day to mine with their hands. And, they use mercury, they use cyanide because artisanal miners. And so not only are they getting like paid dirt cheap to fulfill this global gold rush that's happening, but they're also like the environments are being completely harmed and affected, right? And the same had happened with oil extraction in southern Sudanese, but now it's happening to South Kordofan and Darfurians and other Sudanese people through this gold. And so a lot of there's so many demonstrations and gold mining sites. There's so many demonstrations about first like having proper channels and proper like ways of mining this gold so that the environment isn't affected. But second, also for the revenue to be also somehow given back to the community it's being extracted from, because neither is happening.
Mhm. I want to talk to you for a moment about al-Bashir. We have been vigorously critical on this program of the International Criminal Court, otherwise known as the International Caucasian Court, for giving all of these white Western war criminals who've committed so much criminality and caused so much suffering a free pass. From George Bush all the way down to Donald Trump and so forth and before, and focusing its efforts overwhelmingly on accused persons from the global South, and one of them being al-Bashir. Now, based on what you're telling me, and I think many of us would have been able to glean this even with a sort of a passing understanding of what's going on in Sudan. There is a lot of criminality to go around in Sudan. It's not just Bashir. So, for example, you have, as you mentioned, the RSF committing heinous atrocities. I suspect that you could say the same of the Sudanese armed forces. Yeah. So, for some reason, the ICC decided to focus its ire on al-Bashir. Now, I know you're not, you don't have access to the inner workings of the ICC, but why do you think that is? Why do you think they decided to go after him while giving these other war criminals a free pass?
Well, it's kind of like, so imperialism supports its, like intermediaries until they have no purpose. Al-Bashir had served his purpose. He was nobody. The revolution had officially rejected him, and his own internal like generals, supporters weren't willing to back him. Neither were his UAE and Gulf relations. And he had ruined his relations with the Americans and the Europeans. So, he just served no more purpose. I don't think it's that deep. Okay. And I think they have to do, once in a while, they have to do these things where we care about justice in Africa. And so here, al-Bashir, but does it really? Yeah.
Right. So let's talk about the future then. We can close on this all-important question. The Quad put out a statement in September in which it, sounded, at least, on the surface, to be concerned about the well-being of the Sudanese people and desirous of seeing this violence brought to an end. And it called for the respect for Sudan's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity. It said there's no viable military solution to the conflict. All parties to the conflict, it said, must facilitate rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access and assistance throughout Sudan. It said Sudan's future governance is for the Sudanese people to decide through an inclusive and transparent transition process. It said external military support to the conflict parties in Sudan serves to intensify and prolong the conflict and contribute to regional instability. Now, this is, of course, the statement's being put out at a time when Donald Trump is the president of the United States. This kind of language does not sound at all Trumpian. Uh, what do you make of this statement? Do you think it's serious? Do you think it's just an attempt on the part of the United States government and its proxies in the region to cover up, mask their complicity in the suffering of the Sudanese people? Or do you think that this statement marks a real shift in their attitude towards Sudan?
I don't think it marks a shift because they're still acting very duplicitly in terms of now there's talks of a truce that's coming. There's talks of a potential kind of sit down. But like I told you, like the reality is neither of these forces are capable of ushering in any kind of democratic transition. So, I mean, the reality is, okay, you believe in the territorial integrity of Sudanese people. One thing is the way the war is going and the way the regional occupation of the different forces seems like there's an interest in splitting Sudan into two with two different factions, right, leading different sides. And so if you do what they say? They said the territorial integrity of Sudan. If you do believe in that, then you wouldn't be setting up a truce process that would partition this country into two, right? Especially under the hands of the very people who've been massacring the people. And then another thing is that there's all of these conversations about, oh, we support the Sudanese people. Then support them practically. Boycott the UAE, stop the financial infrastructure in which both these forces lobby their money, they get their funding from, right? Stop, make concrete where there's a range of Sudanese diaspora telling you what can be done, right? Telling Congress, telling different folks what can be done. Like actually do that. Instead of just like the words, we agree, we did this. Like I even recently saw that I think it was an Emirati official who was like, oh, or a Qatari official, but who said like, oh, we shouldn't have supported the army and the military, or we should have kind of pushed them back. But it's too late. There is no need for words anymore. Like you discussed, and I think we didn't talk about the catastrophe, but 40 million people in that country, and 20 million are facing starvation. More than a quarter are displaced. And just like people in Al Fashir were eating like feed, like animal feed to survive. People were smuggling food, like people are creating makeshift like hospitals to just, and none of it, there's no help, and so, I mean, the reality is that these kinds of, I think for me, it upsets me to see statements like this because I think it's really such utter disrespect to the death and to the lives of people that are every day deteriorating. So, like, stop putting out these statements, and actually, if you want to do something, do concrete things, like end the kind of supply both these forces are getting financially, infrastructure, logistically. I mean, you have Canadian, like Israeli-led Canadian firms helping the RSF rehabilitate their image. It's the world is complicit in what's happening to the Sudanese people, and global capitalism is at the heart of that complicity. But there's people behind how these things are run, and so I think these statements, like I told you, I just anger me. I don't even. Yeah, I think it's such disrespect.
So you've touched on this already, but let me put the question to you so we can be very clear, those of us who are horrified by what's happening in Sudan. For those of us who live in the West, what concrete demands should we be making of our governments to bring this horror to an end?
Yeah, I think a UAE boycott is already underway. Like people are calling for that in different forms of what that boycott might look like. I think that's for sure. I think like calling a representative. There's been effort in with some, I think, American political officials trying to do something around this. I don't know how far it's went, but I do know like a lot of the diaspora are acting on that. Yeah. I think that's the first step because I can tell you, there's Egypt is supporting, Iran is supporting the army, Egypt is supporting the army, Ethiopia has been duplicitous in supporting different factions when it suits them, Eritrea is supporting different, so it's so complex, but the reality is we know the UAE is one, like that is the one clear thing we know is the UAE is completely central to why the war is still ongoing. And so I think starting there is important. And I think the second step would be to make more things transparent so we know where we go next, right? Like, because we know the UAE is not the only complicit, directly involved actor in this war. But we do know, like, that is the factually proven state. And so I think all our efforts can start there.
So before I let you go, please tell us where people can find your work and what we should be, for those of us who want to continue to follow closely what is transpiring in the country, what are the better sources of information in that regard?
I would definitely, should I put the link in the chat? I would definitely tell people go read Atar Network. They've been like publishing news, but also like journals, and it's just great on the ground information that's coming out from them and good analysis, right? So Atar Network is a great resource for people who speak English. My writing can be found on Pambazuka News. I would urge people actually to go read the last article I wrote, The Counter-Revolutionary War in Sudan, No Justice, No Peace. So I mean, there I outline the kind of duplicity of the UAE, the EU, and different other countries, including the US. Yeah.
We'll put a link to your article in the description, to the video on YouTube, also a link to the Atata Network. Are you on social media? Are you active on X or other platforms?
Not really. I'm not active on social media. Yeah, but I mean, like, people, if anybody wants to reach out, has any questions to you, and if they want to reach out through you, I'm definitely open to that. I'm not big on socials, though.
Thank you very much, Maki. This has been fascinating, and I hope we can have you back on the program as this story unfolds.
Yeah, for sure, Dimitri. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for talking about the Sudanese war and the Sudanese people's struggles. It's really important for us. Thank you.
It's core to our mission. So thank you very much, Maki. We'll sign off for now from Montreal, Quebec. It's Dimitri Lascaris on November 12, 2025.